Here's a possible introduction to your YouTube video story. It started as a quiet afternoon, the kind where even the smallest disturbance feels like a thunderclap. Officer Mark Daniels was making his usual rounds, patrolling a neighborhood known for its historic homes and tight-knit community. He was a veteran cop, dedicated, respected, and always ready for the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to stumble into. A call came over the radio, a break-in at a house near the end of Elmwood Street. Mark knew the area well. It wasn't the kind of place where things like this happened often. The house in question was an old Victorian, its towering facade painted a pristine white, the kind of home that looked like it held secrets. Mark parked his cruiser and stepped out, the crunch of his boots on the gravel driveway echoing in the stillness. The front door was slightly ajar. The paint around the lock was scratched, evidence of a forced entry. Mark's hand instinctively went to his sidearm. He pushed the door open with deliberate caution, calling out into the house. No response. He could hear the faint creak of wood as he stepped inside, the air thick with a strange tension. The living room was immaculate, books neatly arranged on the shelves, a chessboard set up mid-game on a coffee table, and a collection of military medals displayed proudly on the mantel. It didn't take long for Mark to piece together that whoever lived here had a history of service and discipline, but something felt off. A shattered vase lay near the staircase, its broken pieces scattered like breadcrumbs leading upstairs. Mark followed the trail, his heart pounding slightly faster now. At the top of the stairs, he found a partially open door. When he nudged it open, his eyes were drawn to the strange sight inside. The room was a home office, papers strewn across the desk and floor, drawers yanked open as if someone had been searching for something. And there, on the wall, was a large portrait of a man in a Navy uniform. Before Mark could study it closely, his radio crackled. "Backup is on the way," the dispatcher informed him. But before he could reply, he noticed something else. Red paint was smeared across the floor, leading to a corner of the room. And then, from behind him, he heard the faint sound of footsteps. Spinning around, Mark's hand hovered over his weapon. He saw movement, a shadow darting down the hallway. He gave chase, calling out for the person to stop. But before he could reach them, something hit him hard. It wasn't a bullet or a fist. It was paint. Bright red paint splattered across his uniform and face, momentarily blinding him. He stumbled, trying to wipe it off, as the figure disappeared out the back door. By the time Mark regained his composure and made his way outside, they were gone. Standing there, drenched in red, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random break-in. His suspicions deepened when backup arrived and they began coming through the house. In the corner of the office, hidden beneath a pile of papers, was a file labeled Confidential. The name on the folder stopped Mark in his tracks: General Marcus Harris. Mark's mind raced. General Harris wasn't just a name, he was a legend. A Black U.S. Navy general, celebrated for his groundbreaking achievements and unwavering leadership. This was his house. And now it seemed someone had gone to great lengths to target him. But why? Mark didn't have the answer yet, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary case. As the night deepened and more questions arose, Mark realized he had just scratched the surface of a story far bigger than he could have imagined. And the truth, that was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. This opening sets the tone, introduces intrigue, and leaves viewers eager to know more. Let me know if you'd like adjustments.
The early morning sunlight filtered through the oak-lined streets, casting long shadows over a quiet neighborhood. Officer Carter adjusted his sunglasses, leaning casually against the squad car. He tapped his fingers on the hood, his partner, Officer Ramirez, scanning the area with a careful eye. They weren't expecting much. A routine traffic stop was rarely more than a blip in their otherwise predictable shift. But today felt different. A strange tension lingered in the air, though neither could quite put their finger on it. A sleek black sedan approached from the distance, its polished exterior gleaming under the rising sun. Ramirez signaled for the vehicle to pull over, a simple motion of his hand. The driver complied without hesitation, pulling to the curve smoothly and shutting off the engine. Carter exchanged a quick glance with Ramirez. "Just another routine stop," Carter muttered, but the unease in his tone betrayed his words. The door of the sedan opened, and a tall, poised woman stepped out. Her tailored navy blue blazer fit perfectly, exuding both authority and grace. Her hair was neatly styled, and her confident stride suggested she was no stranger to high-stakes situations. Yet something in her expression, a calm yet piercing gaze, made both officers straighten instinctively. "Ma'am, please stay in the vehicle," Carter called out, his voice firm but measured. The woman paused, tilting her head slightly, as though deciding whether to comply or to challenge the instruction. After a brief moment, she closed the door gently and stood by the car, her presence commanding the space without a word. Ramirez stepped forward, clipboard in hand, his posture professional but wary. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you know why we stopped you today?" The woman's lips curved into a faint smile. "I believe the speed limit was observed, officer. Perhaps there's another reason." Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was a subtle edge to it that caught Ramirez off guard. Carter joined his partner, glancing between the woman and the car. "License and registration, please," he said, his tone carrying an unspoken challenge. She didn't hesitate. Reaching into her purse, she pulled out a sleek leather wallet and handed over her documents. As Ramirez scanned the license, his eyes widened slightly. He shot a quick, uncertain glance at Carter, who furrowed his brow in confusion. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone steady, though there was an undeniable weight to her question. Carter took the license from Ramirez, studying it carefully. The name on the card matched a familiar one they'd heard in departmental briefings, but it couldn't be. "Not here, not like this." He looked up at the woman, her composed demeanor now tinged with what could only be described as subtle amusement. "Wait," Carter stammered, his confidence wavering. "Are you?" The woman tilted her head, her smile widening slightly. "Is there something you'd like to ask, officer?" she said, her voice laced with quiet authority. Before either officer could respond, the crackle of their radio interrupted the tense silence. "Unit 42, confirm your location. Chief Daniels is en route for a surprise inspection," the dispatcher announced. The realization hit both men like a thunderbolt. Carter felt his throat tighten, and Ramirez's grip on the clipboard faltered. "Chief Daniels." The name echoed in his mind as he looked back at the woman standing before them. She wasn't just any driver. She was their new boss. But before they could utter another word, the woman glanced at her watch and then back at them. "Time's ticking, gentlemen," she said, her tone cool but expectant. "Shouldn't you be preparing for your inspection?" And just like that, the dynamics of the encounter shifted completely. For a moment, neither officer spoke. The woman's words hung in the air, an invisible weight pressing down on them. Carter, usually quick with a retort, found himself at a loss. Ramirez shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing through the implications of what just happened. This wasn't just an awkward misunderstanding. It was a career-defining moment, and the two of them were standing on a very thin line. "I apologize if there's been any misunderstanding," Carter finally managed, his voice strained. He handed back the license with a slightly trembling hand, his earlier confidence completely eroded. "We didn't realize." "That I'm your new chief?" she interjected, her tone neutral but pointed. She slid the license back into her wallet with practiced ease, her movements deliberate. It's always interesting to see how things operate when people think no one is watching. Ramirez swallowed hard. Chief Daniels, we were just following protocol. We didn't mean any disrespect. Her gaze softened, just slightly, but there was still an edge to it. I appreciate protocol, Officer Ramirez. What I don't appreciate are assumptions. She stepped closer, her eyes flicking between the two men. Do you understand what I mean? Carter opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He nodded instead, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. Ramirez gave a quick "yes, ma'am," his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel straightened her blazer and glanced at her car. I'll let this slide, given the circumstances. But I expect better. From both of you. She glanced at the squad car, then back at them. Are we clear? Yes, Chief, they said almost in unison, their voices tinged with embarrassment. Satisfied, she nodded and moved toward her car. But just before she opened the door, she paused, turning back to face them. One more thing. Make sure you report to the precinct on time today. We'll be having a department-wide meeting. Non-negotiable. Without waiting for a response, she slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As the sleek sedan pulled away, Ramirez exhaled loudly, running a hand through his hair. Did that just happen? He muttered, glancing at Carter, who was still staring down the street where the car had disappeared. Carter shook his head, trying to gather his thoughts. Man, we're lucky she didn't rip us apart on the spot. Can you imagine what could have happened if we'd said the wrong thing? His voice carried a mix of relief and dread. Yeah, well, I don't think she's the kind to forget something like this, Ramirez said, his expression troubled. She's probably already sizing us up. Carter leaned against the hood of the squad car, his mind flashing back to the briefings they'd had about the incoming chief of police. He remembered hearing her name, Camille Daniels, but there hadn't been much more than that. Just another name, another boss, someone to give orders and sign off on paperwork. But now, after meeting her face to face, it was clear she was much more than that. She carried herself with authority, yes, but there was something else, something that made him uneasy. It wasn't just her rank. It was her presence, her ability to command respect without raising her voice. We need to get our act together, Carter said finally, pushing off the car. If she's the kind of boss who pulls surprise inspections, we're going to have to stay sharp. No more coasting. Ramirez nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. She didn't seem angry, though. More like disappointed. That's almost worse, isn't it? Definitely worse, Carter agreed with a grimace. He glanced at his watch. We should head back. The last thing we need is to be late for that meeting. The drive back to the precinct was unusually quiet. Both officers were lost in their thoughts, replaying the encounter over and over. By the time they arrived, the parking lot was already packed with squad cars. Clearly, word had gotten around about the new chief's arrival. The station buzzed with nervous energy, officers and staff bustling around, trying to make themselves look busy and competent. Inside, the briefing room was filled to capacity. Officers lined the walls, some whispering quietly, others sitting stiffly in their chairs. Carter and Ramirez slipped in, finding spots near the back. The tension in the room was palpable. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Chief Daniels walked in. The room fell silent instantly. She moved to the front of the room with the same calm confidence she displayed earlier, her eyes sweeping over the assembled crowd. If she recognized Carter and Ramirez among the faces, she gave no indication. Good morning, she began, her voice steady but commanding. I won't take up too much of your time, but there are a few things we need to address. First, let me say that I'm honored to be here, leading this department. I've reviewed your records, and I see a lot of potential in this team. But potential means nothing without accountability. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Carter and Ramirez before moving on. Let me be clear. My job is not to make your lives harder. My job is to ensure this department operates with integrity, professionalism, and fairness. That means changes are coming. Some of you will adapt and thrive. Others may find this environment less comfortable. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Daniels didn't miss it. I know change can be difficult, she continued, her tone softening just a fraction. But it's necessary. This community deserves our best, and I intend to deliver. I hope you'll all join me in that effort. She paused, letting her words sink in. Then, with a slight smile, she added, one more thing. I like to keep people on their toes, so don't be surprised if I show up where you least expect me. Consider it a reminder to always stay sharp. A few nervous chuckles broke the silence, but most of the room remained tense. Daniels nodded, satisfied, and dismissed the meeting with a simple, "That's all for now. Let's get to work." As the officers began to file out, Carter and Ramirez exchanged a glance. "She's not messing around," Ramirez muttered. "No, she's not," Carter agreed. "And I think we just got a front row seat to what she's capable of." They both knew things were about to change, and not just for them. For the entire department. The fallout from Hendrick's confession sent shockwaves through the department, but the case was far from over. While the immediate threat of the robberies had been addressed, something about the situation didn't sit right with Chief Daniels. She couldn't shake the feeling that Hendricks was only part of a larger problem. His sudden willingness to cooperate during questioning had been almost too convenient, and his story left gaps that couldn't be ignored. Late one evening, Daniels sat in her office, poring over the case files. The precinct was quiet, most of the staff having gone home for the night. A faint tapping sound broke her concentration, and she looked up to see Carter standing in the doorway, holding a stack of reports. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone cautious. Daniels nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What's on your mind, Officer Carter?" Carter hesitated, setting the reports down. "I've been going over the timelines again. Something doesn't add up. Hendricks knew our patrol schedules, sure, but there's no way he could have orchestrated the whole operation on his own. He's not that meticulous." Daniels leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Go on." "I think there's someone else involved," Carter said, lowering his voice. "Someone higher up. The way these robberies were planned, it feels like they had inside help beyond just Hendricks. Someone who could access more detailed information." Daniels didn't respond immediately, but her expression darkened. It was a possibility she'd been considering herself, though she hadn't wanted to voice it until she had more evidence. "And you think Hendricks is covering for them?" Carter nodded. "It's possible. He didn't give us any names during his confession, and it felt like he was holding something back." Daniels tapped her fingers on the desk, her mind racing. If Carter was right, this wasn't just a case of one rogue officer, it was a deeper betrayal. "We'll need to be careful," she said finally. "If there's someone else involved, they'll be watching us as closely as we're watching them." The next few days were tense as Daniels quietly expanded the investigation. She assigned Carter and Ramirez to follow up on leads, urging them to keep their findings discreet. At the same time, she began reviewing personnel records, looking for any signs of unusual behavior or unexplained access to sensitive information. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at the precinct grew increasingly strained. Rumors of the internal investigation spread quickly, and officers began second-guessing each other. Friendships that had once seemed unshakable were tested, and the sense of camaraderie that Daniels had worked so hard to rebuild began to fray. For Ramirez, the situation was particularly difficult. He'd always prided himself on being a team player, and the idea that someone he worked with could betray the department weighed heavily on him. One evening, while on patrol with Carter, he broke the silence that had settled between them. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly, keeping his eyes on the road. Carter glanced at him, surprised. "Leaving the department?" Ramirez nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "And it's too clean. No fingerprints, no footprints. These guys are pros." As they continued to investigate, a faint sound caught their attention, a soft scraping noise coming from the back of the building. Carter signaled for Ramirez to follow as they moved toward the source. They rounded a corner and froze. A shadowy figure stood near an open window, their face obscured by a mask. The figure hesitated for a split second before bolting out the window and disappearing into the night. Carter and Ramirez gave chase, their footsteps echoing against the pavement as they pursued the suspect through the maze of alleyways. The chase ended abruptly when the suspect darted into a waiting car, the engine roaring to life before speeding away. Carter cursed under his breath, pulling out his radio to call for backup, but Ramirez stopped him. "Look," he said, pointing to the ground. Carter's flashlight illuminated a small object that the suspect had dropped during their escape, a keycard bearing the logo of the precinct. Both officers stared at the card in stunned silence, the implications sinking in. The suspect wasn't just connected to the department. They had direct access. As they returned to the precinct to report their findings, the weight of the situation bore down on them. The conflict was no longer just about solving a case. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that threatened to tear the department apart. The discovery of the keycard sent ripples of unease through Carter and Ramirez. They knew what it meant, but struggled to grasp the full extent of it. Back at the precinct, they handed the keycard over to Chief Daniels, her face betraying little as she examined it. "Where exactly did you find this?" Daniels asked, her voice steady but firm. Ramirez recounted the pursuit in detail, his words quick but precise. Daniels listened intently, her eyes narrowing as he described the suspect's calculated movements and the flawless timing of their getaway. When he finished, she placed the keycard on her desk, her fingers tapping it rhythmically as she processed the information. "This confirms my suspicions," Daniels finally said, her tone low. "Whoever is behind this has deeper connections to the department than we realized. We're dealing with a sophisticated operation, and this is just the beginning." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Carter leaned forward, his expression tense. "What's our next move?" Daniels didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the city lights. "We need to flush them out," she said after a moment. "But we can't risk tipping them off. They're watching us, which means we have to play this carefully." The weight of her words settled over the room. It wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about uncovering a network of betrayal that could reach anyone within their ranks. Carter and Ramirez exchanged a glance, unspoken agreement passing between them. They were in this together, no matter how dangerous it became. Over the next few days, the tension in the precinct grew palpable. Daniels initiated a series of changes, quietly rearranging patrol schedules and restricting access to sensitive information. She kept her inner circle tight, sharing details only with Carter, Ramirez, and a select few she trusted implicitly. At the same time, Carter and Ramirez worked tirelessly to trace the keycard back to its source. They pored over records, cross-referencing access logs and personnel files, looking for any anomalies. The process was painstakingly slow, but their persistence began to pay off. Patterns emerged, subtle discrepancies in the schedules, unaccounted entries in the logs, and connections that hinted at a coordinated effort. One name kept surfacing: Lieutenant Marks. A seasoned officer with years of experience, Marks was respected by his peers and had a spotless record. On the surface, he seemed like the last person who would be involved in something like this. But the evidence told a different story. His access logs showed him entering restricted areas at odd hours, and several of the patrol schedules he'd approved aligned suspiciously with the times and locations of the robberies. When Carter and Ramirez brought their findings to Daniels, she didn't seem surprised. "I've had my eye on Marks for a while," she admitted. "But I needed something concrete to act on. This might be it." Despite the mounting evidence, Daniels knew they couldn't confront Marks directly, not yet. They needed more proof, something undeniable that would hold up under scrutiny. She devised a plan to monitor him discreetly, assigning Carter and Ramirez to follow his movements while she worked to secure a warrant for his phone and financial records. The surveillance was grueling. Carter and Ramirez took turns tailing Marks, watching as he went about his seemingly routine activities. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. He attended meetings, completed paperwork, and even went out for coffee like any other officer. But late one night, something changed. Marks left the precinct in a hurry, driving to an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. Carter and Ramirez followed at a safe distance, their nerves on edge. Marks parked near an abandoned warehouse, disappearing inside without hesitation. They waited, their eyes fixed on the dimly lit building. Minutes turned into hours, and just when they thought he might not emerge, Marks stepped out, accompanied by two men in dark clothing. One of them handed him a briefcase, the exchange swift and deliberate. Ramirez reached for his phone, snapping a series of photos as evidence. The three men parted ways, Marks driving off while the others disappeared into the shadows. Carter and Ramirez didn't follow. They knew the risk of being spotted was too great. Instead, they returned to the precinct, their minds racing with questions. What was in the briefcase? Who were the other men? And most importantly, how deep did this conspiracy go? When they reported back to Daniels, she listened intently, her expression grave. "This confirms it," she said, her voice steady but grim. "Marks is involved. But we still need to know who he's working with and what they're planning." The following days were a blur of activity as Daniels moved to secure more evidence. The warrant for Marks' records came through, revealing transactions that linked him to offshore accounts and suspicious payments. It was enough to confront him, but Daniels hesitated. She knew they were on the verge of something much bigger, and acting too soon could jeopardize everything. As the team prepared to move forward, the atmosphere in the precinct grew increasingly charged. Whispers of suspicion spread among the officers, and the tension was almost unbearable. Daniels knew time was running out, but she also knew they couldn't afford a single misstep. Then late one night, Daniels received an anonymous tip. The caller claimed to have information about the operation and insisted on meeting in person. The voice was calm but urgent, warning her that the network was closer to collapsing than she realized. Daniels agreed to the meeting, her instincts telling her it was a risk worth taking. The rendezvous was set for an abandoned park on the edge of town, the location chosen for its isolation. Daniels went alone, her nerves steel for whatever awaited her. As she approached the meeting point, the shadows seemed to close in around her, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. A figure stepped out from the darkness, their face obscured by a hood. Daniels stopped, her hand hovering near her sidearm. "You have information?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The figure nodded, their voice low and urgent. "They know you're onto them. Marks is just the tip of the iceberg. If you don't act now, they'll disappear, and you'll never catch them." Daniel's heart raced as the weight of the words sank in. The situation was spiraling, and the climax was approaching faster than she'd anticipated. Daniel studied the hooded figure carefully, her instincts telling her to stay cautious. Whoever this was, they clearly had inside knowledge, but the question of their motive loomed large. She decided to press them. "How do you know all of this? Who are you, and why are you helping me?" The figure hesitated, shifting slightly as though weighing their next words carefully. "Let's just say I used to be part of their inner circle. I saw too much, got in too deep, and now I want out. But the only way I can get out clean is if they're taken down for good." Daniels frowned. This confession raised even more questions. If they had been on the inside, their knowledge could be invaluable, but it also made them a potential liability. "What do you mean by too deep? Who's running this?" She demanded, her tone firm. The figure sighed, lowering their voice further. "It's bigger than Mark's. He's just one cog in the machine. The real mastermind, it's someone you'd never suspect. Someone with enough pull to keep everything running smoothly while staying completely under the radar." Daniels felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected the conspiracy reached higher up, but hearing it confirmed made the situation all the more daunting. "Give me a name," she pressed, stepping closer. The figure glanced around nervously before speaking. "Captain Reeves," they whispered. "He's been the one orchestrating everything. The robberies, the laundering, even some of the promotions. He's pulling all the strings." Daniels froze. Captain Reeves? The idea was almost inconceivable. Reeves had been a mentor to many, including Daniels herself. He was a respected figure, known for his dedication and leadership. The thought of him being involved in something so corrupt felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed about him. But there was no time to dwell on the shock. If this information was true, it changed everything. Daniels knew she needed proof before making any moves against someone as influential as Reeves. She turned back to the figure. "If what you're saying is true, I'll need evidence. Can you provide it?" The figure nodded. "There's a meeting scheduled tomorrow night at an old warehouse near the docks. Reeves will be there, along with his top associates. They'll be discussing their next move. If you can intercept it, you'll have all the evidence you need." Daniels didn't hesitate. "I need more details. What time? How many people? And how do I know this isn't a setup?" The figure straightened, their tone steady. "You don't. But if you want to stop them, this is your best chance. They've already started covering their tracks. By the end of the week, they'll be gone, and you'll lose them for good." Daniels watched as the figure turned to leave, their silhouette disappearing into the shadows. She stood alone in the dark park, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd just learned. If Reeves was truly behind everything, the situation was far more dangerous than she'd imagined. The next day at the precinct, Daniels called Carter and Ramirez into her office. She closed the door behind them, her expression grim. "We have a lead," she said, her voice low. "And it's big. Bigger than any of us thought." Carter frowned. "What's going on?" Daniels hesitated before continuing. "The person behind all of this, it's Captain Reeves." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sunk in. Ramirez was the first to speak. "Reeves? Are you sure?" Daniels nodded. "I've received credible information that points directly to him. He's been using his position to manipulate the department and cover his tracks. And now we have a chance to catch him in the act." She explained the details of the meeting at the warehouse, emphasizing the importance of gathering evidence without alerting Reeves to their presence. Carter and Ramirez exchanged a look, their resolve clear. "We're with you," Carter said firmly. As night fell, the team prepared for the operation. Daniels coordinated with a small, trusted group of officers to set up surveillance around the warehouse. Every move had to be calculated. One mistake could tip off Reeves and his associates, putting the entire operation and their lives in jeopardy. When they arrived at the docks, the atmosphere was tense. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, its windows glowing faintly with light from within. Daniels and her team positioned themselves strategically, using the shadows for cover. Through her earpiece, she could hear Carter and Ramirez confirming their positions, their voices steady despite the tension. Inside the warehouse, voices echoed, growing louder as Daniels moved closer to an open window. She peered inside and saw Reeves standing at the center of a group, his presence commanding. On a table in front of him were stacks of cash, documents, and what looked like a detailed map of the city. He was giving orders, his tone calm but authoritative, as though this were just another day of the office. Daniel's stomach churned as she listened. This was the man she had once looked up to, the man who had shaped so much of her career. And now he was the center of the web she had been working tirelessly to unravel. Suddenly, a noise behind her broke her concentration, a faint crunch of gravel. She turned quickly, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. In the dim light, she saw a figure approaching, their face obscured by a mask. For a moment, she thought they might be one of Reeves' men, but then they raised their hands in a gesture of surrender. "I came to help," the figure said softly, their voice familiar. It was the same informant from the night before. Daniels frowned, her guard still up. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "It's too dangerous." The informant shook their head. "You don't understand. There's one more thing you need to know. Reeves isn't the only one. There's someone else, someone higher up." Daniel's heart sank. Higher up? The stakes had just been raised again, and the full scope of the conspiracy remained shrouded in darkness. Daniels felt a surge of adrenaline as the informant's words echoed in her mind. Someone higher up. The scope of the operation was even larger than she had imagined. But there was no time to dwell on the implications. The meeting inside the warehouse was reaching its peak, and she needed to act. Signaling to Carter and Ramirez through her earpiece, Daniels made the call. "We proceed as planned. Stick to your positions until I give the word. We need them red-handed." Inside, Captain Reeves was laying out the next steps of their operation. His confidence was unnerving, each word delivered with the assurance of someone who believed they were untouchable. He didn't just command respect. He instilled fear. Daniels could see it in the body language of the others in the room, the way they nodded without question, their eyes darting to him for approval. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the building. Daniel's heart stopped. One of the team must have slipped. The noise drew Reeves' attention, and he gestured sharply for two of his men to investigate. Daniels motioned for Carter and Ramirez to stay put. She couldn't risk the operation being compromised now. The two men moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Daniels could hear their footsteps growing closer, her breath caught in her throat. Just as they rounded a corner, Carter made his move. With swift precision, he disarmed one of the men, while Ramirez subdued the other. They dragged the unconscious men out of sight, ensuring the commotion didn't reach the meeting inside. Daniels took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. This was it. She gave the signal, and the team moved in. Bursting through the doors, they shouted commands, their weapons drawn. Chaos erupted as Reeves and his associates scrambled to respond. Several tried to flee, but the officers were ready, blocking every exit. Reeves stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locking with Daniels. There was no panic in his gaze, only cold calculation. Slowly, he raised his hands, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Chief Daniels," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I didn't think you had it in you. Daniels didn't rise to the bait. It's over, Reeves. We have everything we need. Your operation is done. But Reeves' smirk only widened. You really think this ends with me? You have no idea what you've stumbled into. Before Daniels could respond, a sudden explosion rocked the building. The force knocked her off her feet, and debris rained down around her. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw Reeves make a break for it, heading toward a hidden exit. Ignoring the ringing in her ears, she pushed herself up and gave chase. The pursuit was intense, the narrow corridors of the warehouse forcing Daniels to rely on her instincts. She could hear Reeves just ahead, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. Finally, she emerged into an open area near the docks, where Reeves was climbing into a waiting speedboat. "Stop," Daniels shouted, raising her weapon. But Reeves didn't stop. Instead, he turned to her, a smug look on his face. "You can't stop what's coming, Daniels. You're too late." Before she could react, a shot rang out. Reeves stumbled, clutching his shoulder, and fell into the water. Startled, Daniels turned to see Ramirez lowering his weapon, his expression grim. Together, they rushed to the edge of the dock, but Reeves was gone, the dark waters swallowing him whole. Back at the precinct, the aftermath of the operation was chaotic. Several of Reeves' associates had been arrested, and the evidence they'd gathered was overwhelming. But Daniels couldn't shake the weight of his final words. What had he meant by too late? As the dust settled, Daniels called for a debriefing with her team. They reviewed the evidence and the arrests, but one question lingered. Who was the person higher up? Despite their success, the operation felt incomplete, the shadow of a larger threat looming over them. Then a breakthrough came. Among the confiscated documents, they found a ledger with cryptic entries, each corresponding to major events and operations. One name appeared repeatedly, M. Harrington. Daniel's heart sank. Harrington was the city's deputy mayor, a figure with considerable influence and power. This revelation sent shockwaves through the precinct. If Harrington was involved, the corruption extended far beyond the department. Daniels knew exposing him would be even more dangerous, but she also knew they couldn't stop now. As she prepared for the next phase of the investigation, Daniels reflected on the night's events. They had struck a significant blow against the operation, but the battle was far from over. The fight for justice was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher.